Martin-Prashad to the stage.
Who are we? When I was younger, I knew who I was. The child who dreamed up fantasy worlds, who spent more time in her imagination than in reality, and was never afraid to be unique. Then, as I got older, life piled things on top of me. Fantasy worlds became less important than schoolwork. Spending time in my imagination got me in trouble. And being unique suddenly felt embarrassing. I suddenly lost sight of that happy little girl who was certain of who she was and became someone immersed in my insecurities instead. Does this story sound familiar to you? Chances are, it's the story of most of us in this room. So how do we get back? How do we rediscover ourselves? Through the most human way possible, fiction. Our first story is about John. John had the imagination of a child, burying himself in fantasy books and made-up languages since childhood. He dreamed of becoming a writer and was eventually sponsored to attend Oxford University. Then, he was finally one step closer to his dream until he was called to serve his nation in war. As a lieutenant in World War I, sitting in the trenches, John was in hell, with only the roar of gunfire and the smells of death to keep him company. Surviving trench fever gave him his release papers from the war and allowed him to pursue his greatest ambition yet, writing an entire epic that takes place in a land not so different from our own, Middle-earth. As he wrote his great stories, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, better known as J.R.R. Tolkien, always felt as though he were writing some form of truth. And the truths he was writing about were the hopelessness of war and inspiring people to achieve great things in the face of challenging odds. When I read Lord of the Rings, I saw myself in Middle-earth, fighting alongside elves and dwarves to make the world a better place. Tolkien's stories gave me a space where I could immerse myself in my imagination. And they also showed me the kind of life that I wanted to live for myself in my real time. Through identifying with his characters and following them along their journeys, I was thus inspired to live my own journey. For instance, the characters from Lord of the Rings I mostly identified with were hobbits. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, hobbits are small human-like creatures who live in houses under hills and have big hairy feet. They're characterized as children, naive about the evils of Middle-earth and completely unaware of any dangers lurking beyond their borders. One day, the hobbits get summoned on an unexpected and dangerous adventure, which leads them to grow out of their naivete as a result. No matter how small and innocent they were to begin with, they still go on to eventually change the course of Middle-earth's history. For me, reading about the journey of the hobbits inspired me to embrace growing up. By reading Tolkien's books, I was able to complete that same journey from innocence to wisdom, all in the face of challenging odds, through identifying with his characters. Our next story is about Boris, who dreamed of writing beautiful poetry and prose. In his time, he was widely praised and admired as one of his country's most beloved poets. Except that Boris lived under an authoritarian regime that controlled all forms of creative expression. His passion for the arts pitted him against his government. At the time, great authors were not only arrested, but also had to serve a life of internal imprisonment, a kind of solitary confining of the self, as Jeffrey Myers puts it. One day, Boris's lover, Olga, was imprisoned in a Lukyanka prison camp for 3 years. The reason for this was because Boris had been defying his government. the secret police found out that despite his loyalty, Boris had been secretly working on a defiant novel called Dr. Zhivago. The government tried to stop the book from getting published, but they were outraged when they discovered that the book had been circulating through other countries instead. And their outrage only caused the book to grow in popularity, leading Boris to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1958. What is moving about the story of Boris Pasternak is that he did not let his circumstances define his life and end his dreams. He instead used his dreams to inspire millions of people through a story about freedom and the power of using their voice. And the only way that he could do that was through fiction. The story of Boris Pasternak inspired me to turn to fiction as my form of self-expression. The past 2 years haven't been kind to many of us. Every day we've been faced with the same kinds of monotonous orders. And that frustrated me, because I felt that all I could do was to follow them. It didn't matter whether they were right or wrong. All that mattered was that I felt that I couldn't question them. Just like Pasternak, I felt that if I asked a simple question, then people around me would dismiss me, not listen to what I had to say, and even get upset at me for questioning. So I looked to Boris Pasternak as a form of inspiration. The story inspired me to turn to fiction and to embrace it as a way of using my voice. In the film adaptation of Dr. Zhivago, there's a scene containing a confrontation between the poet and protagonist, Yuri Zhivago, and his mistress's former husband, Pasha. Pasha dismisses Yuri's poetry, believing it to be absurdly personal and dangerous to the rules of conformity. After watching that scene, it became clear to me what Pasternak was really trying to say through his story. That the role of the artist is to ask thought-provoking questions, no matter how controversial, for the benefit of everybody. Our final story centers around a remarkable woman. Joanne always loved to read and write, but never knew what she had to say. One day, she was sitting on a train on her way from Worcester to London, where she had been house hunting with her boyfriend from university. But she wasn't happy. And sitting there in her misery, Joanne could have been thinking of many different things. Her mother's health was deteriorating. Her boyfriend wanted her to move in with him. Her parents were both concerned for her. But all Joanne could think about in that moment was a boy on a train, bound for a school that taught witchcraft and wizardry. And all she knew was that she had to tell his story. So begins the journey of J.K. Rowling. After Rowling moved in with her boyfriend, she awoke just before New Year's Eve to discover that her mother had died from the effects of multiple sclerosis. The grief became unbearable for her. Her mother had never even known that she was working on Harry Potter. After losing her mother, much of this grief made its way into Rowling's writing. She had pain. She had fear. And while trying to endure that pain and fear, she could have gotten lost. Rowling could have tucked away the grief that was eating at her heart. She could have distracted herself from the impact her mother's death was having on her. But that would only ruin her. So she channeled it through Harry Potter instead. Harry allowed her to release her intense emotions. Through seeing herself in this fictional character, Rowling was able to cope with her grief without letting it overwhelm her. Fiction became a form of hope for her because it enabled her to move on with her life while also accepting the fact that her mother had just died. When I read the Harry Potter series and watched the films, the one thing that resonated with me the most from Rowling's stories was always her imaginary realm, which is referenced as the Wizarding World. In each of Rowling's stories, she always sends her characters off on perilous adventures, many of which terrify them. but despite the tragedies and losses that those characters endure, they always return to a place of safety and comfort, surrounded by the people they love. And most importantly, the story always ends on a note of hope, created by what writers like to call world building, a term used to describe the construction of a fictional realm. Reading and watching the Harry Potter series enabled me to feel that same sense of safety and comfort. It made me feel as though I had just come back from a long day to the loving embrace of my family and to my cozy home. In the face of my insecurities, I turned to the power of fiction to restore touch with who I am. As both a reader and a writer, I started to use fiction to empower myself, to rise to challenges, express my voice, and cherish hope. So now, to come back to our question, who are we? In the face of insecurity, hopelessness, oppression, and grief, the answer is simple. Pick up a book. Pick up a pen. Go watch a movie. And find yourself in a story. Thank you.